I'm Peter Rosenblum, and I'm a professor here at Bard College. In an earlier life, I had the pleasure of being on the same faculty with Jeremy Waldron, and it was because of that that I also was enthusiastic about the opportunity to introduce Jeremy today and to moderate this panel. Jeremy Waldron is currently university professor at New York University Law School, and his books include Dignity, Rank, and Rights, The Harm and Hate Speech, Torture, Terror, and Trade-Offs, Philosophy for the White House, Law and Disagreement, and the Dignity of Legislation. Jeremy Waldron is one of the great public intellectuals of our time. He's a philosopher who clarifies debates in law and a lawyer who clarifies debates in philosophy. He's been someone willing to engage in parsing the often muddled language of lawyers and philosophers and to dive into some of the issues of our time, taking on terminology that's often the language of politics, the language of political correctness and of progressive discourse, and translating it in a complicated way, or translating the language in such a way that it brings out the richness and the intellectual importance of the underlying categories and distinctions. He recently wrote about Jürgen Habermas in the New York Review of Books, and I think much of his reflection on Habermas could be applied to him as well, as a philosopher and a public thinker who has taken on the issues of our times. And I would just say, I mentioned that I had the pleasure of being on the faculty with him, and just in a pure, visceral way, Jeremy made it a pleasure to go to the faculty meetings, particularly the faculty discussion, the paper discussions, the weekly discussions of papers. And he would take on each of these papers, and law schools can be very dry environments, and law school professors can present some of the most tedious papers that you would ever imagine. And somehow in Jeremy's hands, they became part of a much richer, broader, and meaningful conversation. And he would find things in them that I'm sure were never actually there, or not in the mind of the author, and engage those in the room to think more deeply about what could otherwise have been so dry and so narrow. And for someone like myself coming out of human rights, Jeremy's writing on some very broad issues, dignity, for example, or those that are seemingly more narrow and specific, torture, indigenous rights, economic and social rights, are the kind of writing that is all too rare in the field of human rights or in thinking about human rights, but is the kind that any of us who work in the field need to spend more time with, because they so deeply parse the subjects, analyze them, but also are willing to take moral positions and translate those moral positions into the language that of impeccable intellectual credentials. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Jeremy and he'll speak, and then we'll have a chance for a conversation as we've had. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for those very, very kind words. It was a pleasure to be on the Columbia faculty with you. Neither of us is at Columbia now, and the place is poorer on both accounts, I think. I really want to thank Roger Berkowitz and the Hannah Arendt Center for this invitation. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be in this company. Peter said that some of my work is very broad and conceptual about dignity, and some of it's very grubby and specific about torture. I think today is going to be on the grubby and specific end of thinking about privacy and secrecy and surveillance. So, in some interesting recent work on abortion, Carol Sanger, also of Columbia Law School, with whom I share my life, Carol Sanger has explored the distinction between secrecy and privacy. She asked, why do women not talk so much about their experiences of abortion? For example, why did the petitioner in Roe against Wade in 1973 bring her suit under a legally provided alias? Is it just because women think that abortion is a private matter within the zone of their privacy, which it undoubtedly is in several senses of privacy? Or is there also a more troubling explanation? Perhaps women are not forthcoming to the public or even to their friends about abortion because disclosure would impose certain costs on them. They don't just regard the matter as private, they keep it secret for fear of the costs that they may suffer from being known to have engaged in an activity that many Americans revile. So a lot of what Professor Sanger does in the chapter of her forthcoming book about abortion, which is devoted to privacy and secrecy, involves a consideration of what the costs of abortion disclosure might be, and also what the costs of the broader debate of abortion secrecy are. If women are coerced to keep their abortions private, then the general culture loses the benefit of open discussion about abortion that would contribute to the debate that continues. The distinction is undoubtedly a fine one. If one decides to retain certain information about oneself in the zone of the private, one presumably does so for reasons. And a rational choice approach to these matters might characterize any or all of those reasons in terms of costs. For a rational choice theorist, all reasons are about the avoidance of costs and the securing of benefits. But that doesn't mean we should always describe a decision for privacy as a decision to keep something secret. A decision for privacy is a decision to use one's discretion as a matter of self-disclosure, to control who knows what about me. Secrecy involves active and determined concealment, usually in response to certain perceived costs of disclosure, and I don't think that's always the case with privacy. So I want to pick up that distinction and work with it a little bit. This is not a paper about abortion. It is a paper about privacy and surveillance. It's also a paper about secrecy, privacy, and publicness. So we're going to be exploring the conceptual space around those three ideas. It's about surveillance in regard to the war against terrorism. And in this paper, I'm going to use Carol Sanger's distinction between privacy and secrecy as a starting point for considering the efforts that are undertaken by state security agencies and police to surveil and patrol the private lives and actions of millions of ordinary people in order to gain information that may be helpful in combating terrorism. Now, that's a huge subject, but I want eventually to focus on one particular setting, which you could describe as private or public, depending what mood you're in. I want to relate this specifically to surveillance of worship, surveillance of mosques, surveillance of religious free exercise, which we can regard as a private matter in one sense, but many people think it's very important that they bear witness to their religious practice in public and that it not be secreted away as though it were an embarrassing private function. So that's the space I'd like to talk about. A lot of this surveillance involves trying to find out what people we describe as the bad guys are saying to one another and what they are planning. By the bad guys, I mean people already well established in terrorist organizations. We want to hear what they're saying to each other, and also we want to disrupt their ability to communicate with one another, making their organizations less effective. But it's not just about the bad guys. Those who engage in surveillance of religious practice are also interested in the process by which people become radicalized and become involved in, say, jihadist activities or terrorist activities, particularly in the lives of young people. And so there's a troubling dimension to this about the concern that a community should have about some of its more vulnerable members who are open to taking this route in their lives, and their taking this route in their lives may be a matter of public concern. So far as the bad guys are concerned, secrecy seems to be on both sides of the issue. On the side of the bad guys, it's obvious there are things that potential terrorists and jihadists try to keep secret for fear that their conspiracies may be exposed and their activities subject to prosecution or to violent action such as targeted killing by the state. But on the side of state surveillance, there are things that the agents of state security want to keep secret as well. They want to keep their activities secret for several reasons. First, because they are afraid of the obloquy that attaches to surveillance. I mean, politically embarrassing things like Edward Snowden's revelations about the bugging of Angela Merkel's telephone by United States agencies. Secondly, and connected with this, there's the likelihood that if their secret surveillance is exposed, they will have to legally justify and account for it, and this is not something that state agencies normally want to do. They don't like having to account for their actions and having to legally justify it, or it may not be a burden that they're legally or politically able to discharge. And thirdly, and pragmatically, there's a concern that potential terrorists and jihadists may find out exactly how and where they are being watched, and as a result they will make their plans and conduct their conspiracies in other places or through other media that they think the agents of state security don't know about. So you have those three reasons. So the state agents have secrets to keep, and they keep those secrets for fear of the costs that would attach to disclosure. Public denunciation of Edward Snowden's revelations focused on that third set of reasons. But politically, the first and second set of reasons, though unacknowledged by the authorities, were probably just as important. My view, which I know many others share, is that over large areas of activity, state agencies are not entitled, should not be permitted to keep their surveillance secret, however embarrassing openness or revelation might be. We all have a right to know when we are being watched. I don't think there's any alternative to being watched, but we have a right to know when we're being watched and when our communications or aspects of our communications are being monitored. But that doesn't mean that surveillance is wrong. So far, all it means is that secret surveillance is wrong. Open surveillance is another thing altogether, and the rightness or wrongness of open surveillance might be an open question. It may be wrong or it may be permissible, depending on the circumstances. To test this thesis, we might ask the following question: if surveillance were open, would there still be an issue? I don't just mean open as an open secret, as phone tapping by the Stasi in East Germany in the 1960s and 1970s was an open secret among the citizens of East Germany. I mean open in the sense of disclosed and public, like the presence and alertness of a uniformed police officer on the streets, or perhaps more problematically, those hundreds of thousands of highly visible and omnipresent surveillance cameras in England, every corner, everywhere you turn. But it's open. We know they're there. We know there's a camera. There's another one. Open perhaps in the sense of being an acknowledged public responsibility, like teachers watching for signs of child abuse. Yeah? It's their job to be alert to certain manifestations of harm if those manifestations of harm become apparent to them. Open perhaps in the sense that the surveillance is open to anybody to find out. People can make Freedom of Information Act requests about surveillance. And open in the sense that surveillance doesn't necessarily involve much more than the presence and watchfulness of an ordinary person in the public realm. And this is the case I'm going to focus on. The agent of the state might attend a service in a church, a temple, or a mosque on the same basis as any other member of the public. If in any of these ways the secrecy of state surveillance were done away with, what concerns, if any, would remain? I ask that not as a rhetorical question. I'm not trying to make a case directly for open surveillance, but I'm trying to take things apart a little bit to see where various concerns are located. I want to see if we can get at the residual concerns and thus develop a more nuanced sense of the privacy issues that surveillance of any kind may compromise. I do want to focus, as I said, particularly on the case of religion. I mentioned a moment ago surveillance that might not involve much more than the presence and watchfulness of an ordinary person in what is more or less the public realm. Although, as I said, this is a problem. An agent of the state might attend an open service in a church or a mosque on the same basis as any other member of the public. Let me give some context. Since 9/11, perhaps earlier, there's been considerable interest by national security authorities in radical activity in mosques in Europe and in the United States. The authorities have wanted to identify radical imams and jihadists and keep track of their activities. Now, some of this has been done, a lot of it's been done by secret means, by undercover agents, by agents provocateurs, and so on. But it has also involved more or less open surveillance as well. From around 2002 until I think 2011, the Department of Justice issued guidelines permitting FBI agents to go into public places of worship. They may visit any place and attend any event that is open to the public on the same terms and conditions as members of the public generally to observe for official purposes. I believe that has now been radically restricted since 2011 in a change of policy after some litigation about and complaining about this sort of FBI snooping. But it's not entirely clear what was revoked. There's hundreds and hundreds of pages of the new set of orders issued by the FBI, and they're not all entirely clear, and they're not all there. The great pages have been blacked out. I think the general right to attend a mosque on the same basis as any member of the public remains, but agents have to get special permission to do this. It's not a routine matter of entry. So let's assume that we're not talking about literal undercover agents, but people who will disclose or at least not dissemble their official status if they are asked. What should we think about the presence of these agents at services in mosques or meetings in Islamic community centres? Is there a threat to privacy in this sort of open surveillance? An FBI agent attends a service at a mosque. He doesn't wear one of those jackets with FBI blazoned on the back, just wears street clothes like FBI agents generally do, admittedly a particular brand of street clothes, but street clothes nonetheless. Comes in with others from the street and he leaves when the others leave. He doesn't deny that he's an agent if anyone cares to ask. Is this a threat to religious privacy? Is religious privacy even a concept that we should want to deploy in this context? Or consider this particular case I mentioned about state surveillance of the formation and growth of ordinary teenagers and young adults, young men and women, again mostly Muslims, who in a few cases develop and act on an ambition to participate in jihad and leave behind their lives and families in Manchester or London or Toronto or Philadelphia to travel via Turkey to Syria or Iraq to join and fight with ISIS in that area of the Middle East. Some authorities are concerned about these jihadic pilgrimages. The concern in the first instance is concern on behalf of the youngsters who have become involved in this. But of course, there is also security concern about what they will do when they return. And in the meantime, there is concern about the recruitment business of ISIS as well. A story published in the New York Times in August gives a little bit of flesh, grubby flesh to put on these abstract bones. It tells about 3 girls from Bethnal Green in London who apparently left happy homes and travelled together to Turkey and then to Raqqa in Syria to join the ISIS caliphate. According to a reporter, a New York Times reporter in London, these were smart, popular girls from a world in which teenage rebellion is expressed through a radical religiosity that questions everything around them. It's a quotation from the reporter. In this world, the counterculture is conservative. Islam is punk rock. The headscarf is liberating. Ask young Muslim women in their neighbourhood what kind of guys are cool or popular at school these days, and they start raving about the brothers who pray. Yeah? Apparently, the Islamic State is making a determined play for some of these girls, tailoring its siren calls to their vulnerabilities, their frustrations, and their dreams, as well as their political beliefs. To onlookers, there were visible signs in the lives of the three girls who were the subject of the story that they were turning to more radical views. One became very religious after her mother died and her father remarried. She began covering her hair and wearing more conservative clothes. So did her friends. They spent more time at the mosque. They engaged in spirited defenses of ISIS at their school, sometimes leading to shouting matches with their teachers. When one of the girls ran away, the father of one of the other girls, the father who had remarried, urged the police to keep a close eye on her. But still, the other two girls, including this one, headed off to join their friend in Syria. The reporter tells us that one police officer was charged with getting in touch with the girls, but he said they were uncooperative and didn't return his messages. This is the sort of open surveillance I'm talking about. He asked the school to set up meetings with them and 4 other friends. 2 meetings took place, one in the presence of the deputy principal and one with the teacher, but even then neither the school nor the police told the families exactly what was going on. On February the 5th, officers gave letters to the girls seeking their parents' permission to take formal statements from them about their best friend's disappearance, but the girls never passed the letters on to their parents. The police commissioner said he was sorry that the letters had never reached the parents. He said, with the benefit of hindsight, maybe we should have sent the letters to the parents directly. Now, of course, it's ludicrously inept, but there is something touching. There is something touching about the openness of this surveillance, as opposed to simply covertly spying on these young women. What is remarkable is how open, if inept, the police surveillance was. They weren't spying on the girls, they were responding more or less openly to open and well-known signals about the girls' radicalization. They were talking to the girls themselves and to their parents. I don't know whether these police forces had agents visiting mosques, but I'm sure the Metropolitan Police in London do have this authority, just as the FBI has here. So what should we think about this? In the nature of things, this sort of surveillance, even if it's open, is going to have to be surveillance of a large number of young men and women, aimed at finding the 2 or 3 here and there who might be heading off to Syria. In order to identify and watch the few, one has to study and intrude upon, in some sense, upon the privacy of the lives of thousands. And still there's this question, if it's open surveillance, still it's surveillance of some of the things that matter most to these young men and women, some of the things that have to do with the turmoil of growing up, some of the things that have to do with the events in their lives that we think are paradigmatically private, the formation and development and change of religious faith and the events, losses and turmoil of a young person's life. Somebody talked in the previous session about the teenager's bedroom, adolescent's bedroom. These weren't police officers going into the adolescent's bedroom, but they wanted to find out the attitudes that were being expressed among these young women among themselves. Carol Sanger distinguished secrecy from privacy, but she also drew our attention to 2 senses of privacy, which has probably been covered in the sessions that happened yesterday. Because of events at NYU, I couldn't come to the Thursday sessions, and I apologize. But 2 senses of privacy. What we call in the trade, and the trade here is constitutional law, decisional privacy. And what I think you're mostly focusing on, we're mostly focusing on in Olin Hall over these 2 days, is informational privacy. The first sense of privacy, decisional privacy, is the juridical sense in which, for example, abortion is said to be an instance of the right to privacy, meaning that the state is not permitted to ban it or to burden it in certain ways. The decision is the woman's to make, it's not the state's to interfere with. The decision, abortion is decisionally hers, and any attempt by the state is constitutionally prohibited. Effectively, what decisional privacy involves is simply protected liberty or protected choice. The second sense of privacy, informational privacy, which I think, as I said, is really what we're concerned about in this conference, is the sense that Sanger was distinguishing from secrecy when she said that people may have an interest in keeping certain knowledge to themselves, having discretion in the exercise of their own autonomy as to whether to reveal it and to whom. In a normative sense of informational privacy, privacy is a privilege we have of keeping things to ourselves if we like, or disclosing them to others as we see fit in the exercise of our autonomy. The two are not the same, although they may be connected. Decisional privacy operates rather like a legal or constitutional term of art, applying more or less to any activity or liberty that is protected by law from interference. So in the 1973 case of Roe against Wade, the petitioner didn't want her real identity publicized, but that wasn't the core of her claim. What she wanted was the right to have an abortion, and she wanted to have struck down the Texas law that stood in her way. The core of her claim was that the state had no right to prohibit or burdensomely regulate abortion, whether that involved revealing people's identities or not. Similarly, in an earlier decisional privacy case, the case of Griswold against Connecticut, that was a case which struck down a law that banned the purchase and use of contraceptives in the state of Connecticut. It was held that that statute violated the right of marital privacy, but the legal situation was that the right to privacy was violated by the prohibition itself, whether that involves snooping into people's bedrooms or not. Decisional privacy. The decision to use contraceptives belongs to the couple in question. So we have that connection. Justice Stevens once said that decisional privacy and informational privacy sometimes are connected. Yeah? Because if a woman is forced to disclose that she is seeking an abortion to those around her, that fact in itself might stand in her way. So the states cannot require a disclosure to her husband, and states must provide a route whereby teenagers can secure abortions without the consent of their parents if for various reasons that consent is unavailable, e.g. because dad is the father of the child. Okay. Now, let's apply this to the case about surveillance of religious activity. We know that worship and the exercise of religion are constitutionally protected activities. The formation of religious belief is not to be subject to state control, and there are limits on whether the state may interfere with a person's acting on their religious beliefs. We sometimes use the term religious privacy to refer to this constitutional protection of the free exercise of religion. And the debates about how far this is, the recent debates about whether certain Christian believers have a right to discriminate against gay couples in the service of their particular religious ideas, gay couples who are seeking some service or other in connection with same-sex marriage, all of this is sometimes referred to as a matter of religious privacy. Yeah? But if it's privacy, it's a decisional sense of privacy. No particular group of evangelists wants to keep their activities secret. They want to bear witness to it in public to the extent that they possibly can. It has nothing to do with seclusion or people keeping things to themselves. Maybe there's one or two cases of First Amendment religious claims that do involve informational privacy. Sometimes the state closes off certain public lands in the West to enable certain Native American religious ceremonies to take place without being watched by members of the general public. Right? So they're protecting an interest in genuine privacy in these matters. And sometimes people have brought lawsuits complaining about too much surveillance of Native American use of eagle feathers, which are basically a protected artifact, when the Fish and Wildlife Service wants to be sure that the feathers are actually being used for a religious purpose as opposed to being sold for souvenirs. So sometimes with religion, there are genuine issues about seclusion, and some people do bristle when the government asks them to disclose their religious faith. It might be a little bit like being required to disclose how you voted in an election, a secret ballot or something like that. But these cases are the exception, not the rule. Mostly religious privacy invokes just the decisional sense of privacy. Nobody's allowed to interfere with my decision to worship or not to worship in this way or to worship that way, to worship pursuant to this set of beliefs or that set of beliefs. Now, I think it's important for our discussion that religious activity does not, therefore, have to be private in the sense of informational privacy in order to be private in the sense of decisional privacy. Traditionally, requirements or practices of keeping religious observance private in the informational sense have characterized regimes of limited or lesser toleration. In the 1780s, the Habsburg monarchies granted lesser status to Protestant sects. They were entitled to private worship, but they were not entitled to have chimes, bells, steeples, or parades in the street. Yeah? You go away and worship according to your Protestant practices, but don't show off to the rest of us. The felt need for religious privacy is often associated with fear of repression or pogrom. And on that account, there's something liberating about a society in which one can disclose one's religious practice, worship with others in a publicly affirmed way. In buildings, maybe you want to keep the rain off your head, but buildings that characteristically have open doors. So you are bearing witness to one's faith in the context of free and open exercise. Sometimes I pretend to be a historical political theorist, and I could go off hobbing and locking about some of this. Hobbes talked about the importance of public worship, and partly what he meant was it's very important for a single society to show a single face to God, not a melange of jarring variety of forms of worship. I'm not talking about public worship in this sense. And if we were to do locking as well as hobbing, I would say it's certainly true that John Locke thought there was an important inward aspect of religion, true religious faith consisting in inward belief, and so it is. Yeah? But that doesn't mean that people don't want, from time to time, on Saturdays or Sundays or Fridays, to display outward and visible signs of their inward and spiritual devotions. Think how much of our public environment, even in a religiously emancipated country like this, is religious. Churches, steeples, uniforms, and so on. Think how much the kickback and the backlash against Islam involved trying to restrict, in various cities around the world, mosques, minarets, buildings that would add that element to the public environment. Think how important to us are the issues that have been raised concerning public manifestations of religious faith by individuals, headscarves, gold crosses, and so on. I think it's very, very important to understand that religion is, by and large, conducted in a way that is public or semi-public. Not only public in the sense of visible, but public in the sense of open. The quintessential American religious activity, one commentator writes, has been group worship, usually in a site specifically designated for that purpose, and given the desires, certainly in some religions, to secure converts, worship services have been open to the unaffiliated. Therefore, the immediate tendency is to consider collective religious activities and religious sites as public events and places. Now again, for the constitutional law technicians, churches, mosques, temples are not places of public accommodation in the technical sense, like a hotel or a restaurant, which cannot turn people away. They are private property, corporately owned, and they are places where, at least for the time being, the religious organizations can discriminate if they want to. But as a matter of practice, religion has been open in this way. So even if they are not places of public accommodation in the technical constitutional sense, de facto, they are open to the public. Though, of course, the members of the mosque might ask the FBI attendee to leave, and if they do, he must go. Right? He's not entitled to remain there against the wishes of the owners of the place. So this brings us then back to this question about what do we think about open surveillance of religious activity of this sort. I've tried to sort of load the dice a little bit by just asking us to dwell for a moment on the value of the publicness of religion. Not to see religion as sort of a embarrassing private function which we are to exercise privately and keep from public gaze. And that's not a point about surveillance so far, but the interesting thing is what it leads us to say about surveillance. So the fact that religious liberty is a protected liberty does not by itself mean that the Constitution defines a privacy interest in the informational sense of privacy. Not in and of itself, but still there may be concerns. I really want to give it, as far as I can, an even-handed account. This is not just denunciation of surveillance, it's an attempt to consider what would be reasonable surveillance responsive to these problems about the 3 young girls from Bethnal Green in London. It's possible that we might want to say that the presence of state agents at churches portends some stronger interference, even if it is not in itself interference with religious liberty. In Tudor England under Queen Mary, when Roman Catholicism was restored temporarily to England, agents of the state would attend church services and they would watch people to see whether people raised their eyes when the host was elevated, the bread and the wine was elevated by the priest, because raising your eyes to follow the elevation of the host was a sign of respect for transubstantiation, and keeping your eyes lowered or looking indifferent would be a sign of objectionable Protestantism. So we certainly, and no doubt these watchers were doing their work openly, but their open work was intimidatory. So there's certainly going to be a set of concerns along these lines about chilling or changing the character of worship and the exercise of religious beliefs. Or it may just have a distorting effect. Patricia Williams, who was also our colleague at Columbia, Patricia Williams, who writes about race, in a wonderful book called Seeing a Colorblind Future, The Paradox of Race, in 1998, described the distorting impact in Harlem of busloads of tourists who wanted to have a bit of an experience of gospel music, as you or I might go to a blues club in Chicago. Yeah? So they would pour into the back of churches in Harlem on Sunday mornings, go clamorously in, knocking over everything that wasn't nailed to the floor, and then listen for a few hymns, refuse the offer, genuine offer, people handing them hymn books so they could join in. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to take their photographs and experience it. That has an impact. And so even when religious places are open in this sense, the presence of various sorts of visitors can sometimes be a problem. And of course there are issues about profiling, there are issues about entrapment, there are issues about what my colleague Sam Raskoff calls official Islam emerging as the state seems to be beginning to move towards trying to sponsor or load the dice in favor of a moderate form of Islam as opposed to a radical form of Islam. So there are all these concerns. I don't want to minimize them. My argument has not been straightforward, and you may be disturbed that I have not simply denounced religious surveillance out of hand. In an imperfect world, dangerous world, there has to be some watchfulness in the community, and the community does have to take some responsibility for the vulnerability of its youngest members. And we are partly considering what role the state should play in that watchfulness. And I don't believe, I hope this is not too much of a heresy to espouse today, that we should eschew or denounce all forms of watchfulness. Yeah? I mentioned the example at the beginning of my comments about the teachers who are on the lookout for signs of child abuse. That's a form of a community taking responsibility, partly through its official members, partly through ordinary citizens' watchfulness. And the question is, if we take the ethos of that on board, how does that impact the Clouseau-like tactics of the Metropolitan Police in London, or the perhaps more sinister practices of the FBI in the United States? I do want to insist that we should avoid the situation of privatizing religion and religious practice, so it comes to be seen as something more or less like sexual activity. We say, you know, don't have your parade, get a room. We want people to feel free to manifest their religious beliefs and bear witness to them in public. But mostly what I've wanted to do today was just to use this arena as a test case for thinking about these key issues: secrecy, privacy, and under privacy, decisional privacy and informational privacy, and publicness, the various senses in which religion and religious observance are and are not public. So there's no bottom line, or the bottom line is just, as they say in The Godfather, do me a favor, take this into consideration in your thinking. Thank you very much indeed.
So thank you very much, and thank you for having made it hard to find a way through and to draw easy distinctions along the way. I know there's going to be a lot of questions, and I thought maybe I would start by a little bit of a comment and a question. As you spoke, one thing that came to my own mind was my own experience of observing fundamentalism in a religious setting as a young man in a yeshiva in Jerusalem, watching as a rabbi was asked about rebuilding the temple and how he first responded in a way that seemed to be about the spiritual rebuilding of Israel, the return of the Jews, and it was very consistent with my understanding of Judaism, the spiritual renewal. And then one of the yeshiva bookers said to the rabbi, "But what about the mosque?" And all of a sudden it was a question about a construction project. And the rabbi said, this was at a time where a couple of years before a young Canadian had tried to blow up the mosque on the Temple Mount. And the rabbi said, "One crazy man tried and failed, another will come along and he'll succeed." And it was clear to me in that space that in that fundamentalist space, that protected space of religion, that something was going on that actually showed a kind of a danger that should have been intruded upon and should inform our sense of what's there. As someone who teaches human rights and has reflected on human rights and religion, the distinctions you've drawn are really so familiar and so rarely touched upon. I've often characterized it to students, and it's too blunt and extreme, that once we bring rights to religion, we transform religion. And in some way, we do at some moments demand something like the religion of the bedroom, that we turn everybody into a particular kind of Protestant who has acted on an individual kind of faith. And there's some extreme examples of how that works. I mean, obviously, human rights and religion requires that religion allow individual choice, the individual choice to, for example, convert. And we know from our own religions, Catholicism, Judaism, some Protestantisms, that conversion was prosecuted up until recent times. And if I talk to my former students and friends who are evangelicals, Jehovah's Witnesses, others, conversion is still nearly prosecuted. It involves a kind of excommunication and exclusion, and within other places even more. So I guess I wonder whether one of my questions is really in thinking about our relationship to Islam, which is one where there's a great deal of unfamiliarity and of suspicion. And there are clearly elements within Islam in terms that would suggest a way of religion that may be in tension with, more so than others, with our ideas about rights in terms of the public manifestation and the public control and the demands on the community and how they operate. So in the first place, we have this suspicion, and some of it may be legitimate, some of it may be by virtue of unfamiliarity, and whether that in itself requires a period of transition towards the kinds of open surveillance that you define, that there has to be, that what in a sense we're missing is some kind of process perhaps of getting to know Islam, of getting to know these communities. The other thing that I thought about as you spoke are a couple of my current colleagues and former students who did the research for Human Rights Watch on surveillance in Muslim communities, and both of them happen to be Muslim. One of them debated with you at the Oxford Debate Club a couple of years ago, Noreen Shah, and did, I thought, fabulous work, and found themselves, you were on the same side, exactly, and probably in this case too, but one of the things they found themselves really torn apart, because on the one hand, there are the horrible stories of the FBI coming in intrusively, provocatively, setting up problems that didn't exist. And on the other hand, often a crying need within those communities to find confidence in the government, to find a way of communicating, to find a way of dealing with their own internal problems. And we found both the communities and the FBI agents themselves caught up within that. So there's a couple of observations just to get us started.
Thank you very much, Peter. Those are really helpful observations. I hope that we can agree that we don't want the state to be sponsoring a favored, moderate version of any religion. We don't want there to be what Sam Raskoff calls official Islam. Yeah? We want to preserve religion's function, which is certainly not to make anybody feel comfortable about their lives or their society. Religion makes us feel uncomfortable, and learning about religions that we're unfamiliar with teaches us new and unfamiliar ways of being uncomfortable. I don't see that one accepts every credo that makes one uncomfortable, but one learns about it. And so one thing that we want to insist is that religion should neither be secluded nor normalized or sanitized. But the price of its non-sanitization and the price of its non-seclusion, or the price of its non-sanitization, is that we simply don't know how dangerous a given set of religious beliefs are in a particular set of circumstances where it hooks up with a particular set of grievances. This is true not only of Islam, it's true of certain forms of evangelical Christianity. It's true in the yeshiva that you talked about, where the hope was that somebody could succeed where the Canadian guy failed. Very few things that a Canadian can do to bring about World War III, but that was one of them. So we don't know how dangerous these are, and dangerous not only to the rest of us, but dangerous to some of the practitioners. As I said, some of these concerns are paternalistic in some, again, uncomfortable sense. Intrusive, perhaps, but born of a certain concern for these young women. So I think that when we bring rights to religion, we have to bend over backwards as a community not to think of that as it were, sanitizing religion. It is certainly true we have this great debate. It's been going on now for many, many years. You remember the case of Board of Employment against Smith, where a man lost his job because he used peyote in a sacrificial setting, and he sued for restoration. He claimed that losing his unemployment benefits was a violation of free exercise, and the Supreme Court said no, the relevant narcotics laws were not aimed at the religion. They just had this impact on religion, and that didn't require strict scrutiny. It didn't help that his job was a narcotics counselor. But since Employment Division against Smith, and since the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that Congress passed unanimously, or almost unanimously in response to Board of Employment against Smith, we have been asking ourselves how far general applicable laws should impact upon religion. And you're seeing this in the debate about same-sex marriage, or the spin-off from the same-sex marriage decisions as well. I think we ought to take very seriously, in my book on hate speech, I asked a question which was, what should a well-ordered, decent society look like? Not just what should it do to its members, but what should it look like? And I thought being disfigured with swastikas and burning crosses was not what a good society should look like. We have a society that doesn't have any official religion, but its horizons are populated with steeples and minarets and so on. And we have to allow that to change in unpredictable and perhaps uncomfortable ways. Hobbes worried that if we present a diversity of visible acts of worship to the Almighty will get confused and the worship won't work, and And people in Switzerland and elsewhere have campaigned against having their horizons disfigured by minarets. It's part of religious freedom that we have to get used to that. In Oxford, where I spent some time recently, in East Oxford, there was a building of a Muslim community centre with minarets, and people were up in arms that this was destroying the Christian character of the built environment in Oxford. I mean, never mind, the Christian character has all the colleges and all the best buildings, but this was East Oxford, well away from the university. And many of those were complaining had never been near a church in their lives and had never organized any sort of outreach to vulnerable people in their lives. This was a community that was building a minaret in connection with its community activities. So we have to be prepared to be not only charitable, but I think live with the discomfort of a world in which the visible manifestations of religion aren't necessarily what we expect them to be.
Yes, do we have someone with the microphone? You have a questioner right here.
In the case of the surveilling of Islam, it seems like once again the trade-off is between privacy and security. And I just was wondering if you could elaborate on like where that threshold can be to have a functional government system and society.
2 points in response to that. I've always been a great believer in David Cole's suggestion that it's not just a privacy, not just a trade-off of privacy and security, our privacy and our security. Often it's a trade-off of their privacy and our security. So the trade-offs often have a disturbing interpersonal as well as intrapersonal. It's not just like me preferring apples for me rather than oranges for me. It's apples for him versus oranges for me. The second thing I wanted to say, I think there is an issue, and there's not going to be any clear threshold. There will be a sense in which intrusions on privacy will become so extensive that we start losing much of what we thought we were trying to secure under the heading of security. Because security is not just about physical safety, as though we could be secure if we were just cowering in a sealed room somewhere. Yeah? The security we want is not only for ourselves, but for a certain way we have, each of us, groups of us, have for living lives. And I think there's enough been said so far in this conference to indicate that privacy is an important aspect of what we're trying to secure. So we're going to be looking for internal connections between privacy and security, as well as the external trade-offs. And the third point, I said there were two, the third point is, what I tried to show in this talk, tentatively, hesitantly, is that it's not always a trade-off between security and privacy, because surveillance of religious observance is not per se a matter of privacy, or if it is, it's a privacy in a complicated sense rather than a simple sense, yeah? Because it's FBI agents openly going into open services. So I wanted to complicate that side of the trade-off as well.
My first question involves government surveillance in political areas. And I know this goes back to World War II. I was personally involved on the side of government surveillance, and I thought it was an extreme invasion of personal property, like opening love letters from home to a soldier and back. The second question involves something that we discussed yesterday and that I'm not fully satisfied with it. The privacy of government. If a government official is busy formulating policy and he wants the privacy before he's being nitpicked by his opposition or by the press so that he can formulate a policy and then come out with it. And the second one is government secrecy. Yeah. The discussion that came up, which involved Snowden, that we had yesterday, where it came down to it that the government really doesn't need the secrecy because everybody already knows about it. But I have a question about that. There have to be some case where the government has the right to privacy, or discussed to secrecy, and I hope you can sort that out for me. Thank you.
Yes. I don't know whether I can sort it out in the few brief moments that we have, but we have to think, if we think about the value of governmental privacy, that is, of formulating policy in private, considering some of the hard choices before they are decided upon, roughly in the character that we would allow our accountant or our lawyer to do some of their work in private before they presented the results to us. Ultimately, the government is accountable to us, and so it's not permitted to keep things private forever, but that doesn't mean to say it mightn't be able to give a good account to us of why certain privacy, and maybe even certain secrecy in secret intelligence was important. On the political areas, you're absolutely right, and it gave me a lot of pause in thinking about my comments, because what is the difference between the FBI going into the mosque and the FBI going to a meeting of the Communist Party? Yeah? Partly the concern is the same. It presages, forebodes, portends a more intimidatory program. We don't want to say that people should keep their political views secret or private because we value free speech in the open. This is not, again, like sexual freedom, or this is, in the end, our political views are worthless if we can't disclose them to others. These are matters that Arendt would call the public realm. But it is very important that people may want to say to the public, for the time being, just as the government has an interest in considering things in private for a while until they figure out what they want to say and work out when it's safe to disclose them, so similarly the citizens may want to do that as they form and reform various parties or organizations. Now there's much, much more to be said, but that's a beginning.
Can we take a couple more questions? Can we take 2 questions from this side, and maybe you could answer both, if you mind?
I really appreciate all your comments on watchfulness and secrecy in public, and I wondered if you could comment on the French law prohibiting Muslim women from covering their face, their whole face, and just their eyes showing out. If you could comment about the balancing of interests in that situation and what you think of it.
And can we take one more from back there, towards the back?
A lot of the discussion of privacy is really kind of revolved around the notion of individual privacy, and it sounds like you're kind of circling around or exploring the notion of a different type of privacy, a privacy that attaches to communities of like-minded people. The religious setting being kind of the most stark because it has constitutional protection under the Free Exercise Clause. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah. There was another question right on the other side of the aisle. Why don't we take it just to hear it as well? And Jeremy will have a chance to respond.
Yes, I had a comment regarding organized religion, and to the extent you view that as a potential threat to privacy, and just an example with the Pope visiting. What if the Pope's message was exactly opposite of what he conveyed, and something that would cause Catholics to take a certain view? And as an example of organized religion impacting the citizenry in this Hudson Valley and whatnot, we have ultra-Orthodox religious groups that are preventing their children from getting a secular education. So they would say that's a privacy concern. I think the public in general might say, well, they should be part of the civic dialogue, and you need an educated citizenry, so therefore the state should be allowed and required to make sure that the children of those, whatever group it is, whether it's Hasidic or Christian, whatever it is, that the state has a role, and privacy should not prevent the state from requiring a adequate secular education of all American children, as an example.
These are all easy questions to answer. And,
no, these are,
really
that's right, yes,
the whole,
yes, and no. But, I mean, I share your concern about the education. The state has a legitimate concern in at least supervising the education of children, if not educating them itself. And partly that's continuous with whatever paternalistic concern is going on in the Bethnal Green case for the young women. Not that we're wanting to interfere with their education, they're being educated in state schools, but we're interested in the formation of character more generally, and the state does have some interest in that. And of course there are going to be limits on what religions can say or do, constituted by the regular laws of the land. On privacy for groups, it's extremely interesting to think about what happens when we move from the individuals to the groups. Many people became outraged when it was said that corporations had a right to free speech. But corporations are just a way in which individuals assemble themselves and work cooperatively together. Karl Marx once remarked that one of the potential dangers with any theory of human rights is that the rights will be conceived of as private, egoistic, solitary. And we need.
You said that a lot more forcefully than that.
I know, but I'm trying to put a good face on it. We do have to. I mean, rights are things that individuals have for themselves, but rights are supposed to open rather than close down vistas of cooperation. And some of the rights and some of the privacy concerns, as well as some of the publicness concerns, are concerns about groups which serve the interests of individuals understood as sociable in some of their deepest activities. Finally, on the French law, I've forgotten where the question. Yes, on the banning of the full covering. I think I agree with you on this, that there's something very disturbing about such bans, as though we were to require all members of all communities to live up to the views about modesty that the majority have. Require people to wear, I don't know, miniskirts or, yeah. I can understand what certain French feminists have in mind when they support the ban. I'm just blanking on the word for the full covering. What's it? Burqa. Of course, burqa. One of the things about the burqa is that it's a little bit like a mobile private realm. You know, we talk about Hannah Arendt on the public and the private, and we talk about the private being the sort of the dark space of the household and the public being the bright light of the agora. The burqa is a little bit like a mobile private realm, as though people were going around in public inside an Edwardian bathing machine, you know, one of those machines that you change in and then go down to the beach. And so people could worry that the manifestation of this in public is a little bit like introducing a oppressive view about privacy and publicly and the public realm, an oppressive view that women must, even when they are moving around in the streets, nevertheless bring a private realm covering with them. I can understand the concern about that. I don't think you think that this would justify a ban, but I think it's very, very important to understand the multiple valences that such a burqa may have and may present and may be taken as. Of course there are security concerns, and those are troubling. Those are very troubling, because there we're, as it were, requiring people to violate their own standards of modesty in order to make themselves more visible to others for everybody else's good.
So I fear that we have to bring this to conclusion. The good news is we're ready for rousing debate, but the bad news is we're already well over our time limit. So
The good news is lunch.
And the good news, the other good news.
Let me just
is lunch.
have attention for one second. First of all, I want to very heartily thank Jeremy Waldron. He